Do you think the pyramids were the end of glory? No. In fact, they were the beginning of a massive collapse. Egypt entered the first chaos in its history. Famine, nobles rebelled, and the country was divided. Historians called it the first age of decline. But while we were living through the collapse, the world was changing. Sumer fell, the Indus Valley flourished, and Stonehenge was built in Europe. But as always, Egypt emerged stronger, and from the depths of darkness, the Middle Kingdom was born.
Look, my friend, after the pharaohs built the pyramids and lived in glory and power, King Pepi II came. This man ruled Egypt for a very long time, the longest reign in all of history, more than 90 years. Just imagine, a king sitting on his throne for 90 years. Of course, with his old age, things slipped out of his control, and his prestige began to wane. And here the disaster began. The power that had been in the hands of the pharaoh slipped away little by little until it was finally in the hands of the nobles and provincial governors. That is, each governor began to act like a small king in his own region, listening to no one, not caring about the entire country. Egypt was divided, and it was no longer the same unit it once was. To make matters worse, the Nile betrayed the Egyptians. The flood that had filled the fields and brought them prosperity began to weaken. The land dried up, the crops died, and the people fell into a severe famine. People who viewed the pharaoh as a god on earth began to ask, "Where is our God? Why has he left us to hunger and ruin?" This frustration reached such a point that texts were written at the time filled with sadness and despair, such as a very famous text called The Complaints of the Eloquent Peasant, which described how the people were oppressed, hungry, and feeling that justice had been lost. And so, the Old Kingdom fell. It wasn't just a king who fell. No, what fell was the idea that the pharaoh was above all else. From here began a new dark era called the First Age of Decline, the first tragic chapter in the history of pharaonic Egypt.
After the Old Kingdom fell, Egypt entered a very difficult period. The country was divided into two halves. In the north, the kings of Heracleopolis ruled. In the south, the kings of Thebes dominated. And it wasn't all that peaceful. No, it was all conflict and small wars, each trying to prove they were the most worthy of rule. Trade, which had flourished during the time of the pyramids, almost came to a standstill. People suffered from chaos and famine, and the country lost its stability, as if it were no longer the Egypt we knew with the glory of the pyramids. But amidst this devastation, another very important aspect emerged: writing. People began writing about death and life after death. We began to see texts like the coffin texts, which tell of the soul's journey after death, meaning despite the suffering, a deeper intellectual and spiritual depth began to emerge. So, what was life like outside Egypt? In Mesopotamia, Babylon was not yet at its greatest power, but the Sumerians and Akkadians were continuing their civilization. In the Indus Valley, present-day India, great cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa had highly developed sewage systems ahead of their time. In China, the first primitive kingdoms began to appear around the Yellow River. As for Europe, the people there were still in the early Bronze Age, meaning their lives were very simple compared to the greatness of Egypt or the civilizations of the Mesopotamian Valley. Amidst all this, Egypt was in a state of decline, but it was also different. A civilization with increasing intellectual and religious depth, despite the loss of political power. Over time, the tide turned. The south, centered in Thebes, began to grow stronger and stronger. One of the greatest kings of the south, Mentuhotep II, decided to win the battle. Around 2050 BC, Mentuhotep enters the north, defeats his opponents, and accomplishes something truly momentous. He reunites Egypt. Thus, the first era of decline ends, and a new chapter in Egypt's history begins. After long years of chaos, famine, and division during the first decline, Egypt needed a leader to unite it once again. From the south, from Thebes, emerged King Mentuhotep II. This man was able to restore unity and move the capital to Thebes. From here, a new era began, called the Middle Kingdom. The Egyptians had learned a harsh lesson from famines and wars. Statues became more realistic, and books were no longer solely religious. Texts appeared that discussed politics, justice, and life after death. There was a clear intellectual maturity, as if the people had acquired a new consciousness. He established a new capital, Ichtatawi, near Fayum. He organized the administration and tightened his grip on power. He wrote instructions to his son to teach him how to rule wisely. Senusret III, warrior king, one of the greatest pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. He led powerful military campaigns in Nubia. He built massive forts on the Nile to protect the borders. He was regarded as a legendary hero, so much so that people considered him a living god. Amenemhat III focused on irrigation projects and water regulation. He undertook a massive project in Lake Fayum. He built the pyramids of Lahun and Hawara. He constructed the Labyrinth Palace, which Herodotus later said was greater than the pyramids themselves. His era was the height of stability and economic prosperity. Mesopotamia, Iraq. King Hammurabi appeared in Babylon and wrote the Code of Hammurabi, the oldest written law code in history. Crete, Greece. The Minoan civilization began building monumental palaces like Knossos, and they were famous for their maritime trade and art. The Indus Valley, India, Pakistan. Stunningly organized cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro with sewage systems more advanced than any civilization of the time. China. The Shah dynasty began its rule there, considered the first ruling dynasty. They developed agriculture and used bronze in weapons. Europe. Still in the early Bronze Age. In Britain, they began building the Stonehenge circles, which remain a major secret to this day. Stability and order returned after chaos. Literature and art reached their peak of maturity. The army was organized and the economy was strong. Egypt again became a major power in the region. But as we've seen before, glory doesn't last forever. After the death of Amenemhat III, Egypt began to weaken. Corruption increased, the regime collapsed, and the country entered a new, dark phase, the second age of decline.